everyone. Welcome to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, Bernhard Gunther, and myself, Laura Matsu. So on this podcast, we're going to be talking about how to break the spell of mass formation psychosis. So obviously, this is a reference to this viral term that Robert Malone shared on his Joe Rogan interview, which got hugely censored. But we're going to bring in another perspective as well, because not only are we dealing with this mass formation psychosis with the mind control and the media manipulation, but a lot of things that we deal with in this world are actually a form of mass formation psychosis. So we're going to really dive into that and talk about it from the emotional and spiritual perspective, as we usually do. So before we get into it, we do have an announcement. So we know that a few people have been waiting for this. We are going to do the Embodied Soul Awakening group coaching program. The next date is going to be April 11th, and that goes into July 2nd. Applications literally just opened a few hours ago, so you can go to either awakenapply.com, or by the time this podcast releases, it should also be linked on Bernhard's website as well. You can go to Bernhard's website at veilofreality.com to get a little bit of an overview on what we're offering. Basically, it's a 12-week group coaching program in psycho-spiritual / even esoteric self-work. So we guide you through a hero's journey. We have weekly calls with you. We give you yoga, meditation, qigong techniques, self-work techniques, so that people can really use these times to really anchor a higher form of consciousness and really just heal and just feel better. That's really our intention. And we have many other intentions woven in with it, but that's our primary intention with these programs. It's a really great way to also just connect with others and just find a safe community where you can kind of share what's going on in the world and have tools to help you work through actually some of the issues that are coming up for people. So yeah, again, you can go to Bernhard's website at veilofreality.com, or you can go to our direct URL, which is www.awakenapply.com. Okay, so yes, how to break the spell of mass formation psychosis. Well, that's like a big question, because I think we're going to ask it also very generally, because as I shared in the beginning, in my opinion, humanity, not even my opinion, but humanity has been under the spell for thousands of years. We've been also removed from nature, removed from our true selves, removed from our actually deeper spiritual potential. So, I've noticed actually that people have been under a spell for a while now. I started breaking out of that spell myself. I guess it started in 2000 when I was 18, but then I got derailed for about a decade, and then I started again after my Saturn return. So let's talk about that.
You know what, as you were sharing that, it reminded me of what something Adyashanti said, and I'm paraphrasing him. He says that people always look for an altered state, medicine plants, they get in an altered state, higher consciousness and all of that. But he made a good point that he said we are already in an altered state, basically in a psychosis, mass formation psychosis.
Exactly.
We need to become sober.
Exactly.
Right? To see the truth, the reality.
Yes.
And the ultimate mass formation psychosis is really, as cheesy as it sounds, but the illusion of separateness.
It's samsara.
Samsara, right? We live in this Maya and this illusory ego personality we identify with, and we experience everything outside ourselves separate from the personality we identify ourselves with, right? So that's the original.
And I think the biggest mass formation psychosis is that we actually experience ourselves from separate from the divine.
That's the original wound, the original quote sin. I wouldn't even sin, but that's a whole distortion itself. But that's also, even like as Reggie Reyes talked, that's the original trauma. Hence, everybody's traumatized is the identification with the ego personality and the separation from God, the original abandonment as well, so to speak. Right?
Yeah.
Kicked out of the garden from Eden, the fall from Eden. That's how it's symbolized, really.
Exactly. So maybe we can talk about how humanity has been under this spell of mass formation psychosis for thousands of years. So how far back?
Well, because, we can see it again on different levels of consciousness or different levels of reality, right? I always like to refer, as listeners and readers maybe know, I'm gotten deep into Sri Aurobindo's work, Integral Yoga, and here's in his book, The Life Divine, he really lays out an amazing cosmology in light of the evolution of consciousness, where it all began, where it's going towards, right? Because we haven't finished evolution yet with the rise of mental man. We are destined to become the Gnostic divine being, even transcending death and all of that. That's in some distant future. But I think it has even increased more intensely, the mass formation psychosis, when a certain dark force entered, this game, so to speak. And you can see it from various different traditions, the Gnostic tradition, the archons, or, Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga, the dark forces have interfered with human evolution, right? And hence it's even harder now. He even said, I'm paraphrasing in his work, that the evolution of consciousness would have been more harmonious if it wouldn't be for the interference of the dark forces of darkness, right? That have kind of hijacked humanity. And you see the same thing happening or described by Wetiko, the Native American virus, the disease of the soul that have taken over humanity. And listeners to the show are probably already familiar with the term Wetiko. That's also based on Paul Levy's work. And he actually just released his new book, Wetiko, Healing the Mind Virus That Plagues Our World. He just sent me a copy and I'm reading through it. It's excellent as always, going deep into this whole topic. And just on a side note, I will be having him on this podcast soon again to talk about all that. But the point being is various traditions talk about these other forces that interfere and influence with humanity, as people who follow my work are aware of as well. You see it in esoteric Christianity, Sufism, shamanism, as well as integral yoga, as I just mentioned. So this whole, spell we have been under has been more intensified through these other forces that kind of have hijacked this whole evolutionary path. But in the end, again, we don't want to fall into the victim blame trap. Everything, when you're looking from the much bigger picture perspective, has a lesson in light of the evolution of consciousness. So these occult forces, as all the esoteric traditions have also emphasized, need to be seen as teachers, because they highlight what we need to work on, and kind of, there's a whole paradox almost. It kind of creates more friction in order to really engage in the great work, to connect our true being, right? So the way out of this mass formation psychosis on the bigger picture is the great work, to work on all levels, to reunite to our true self, our divine nature, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the answer is kind of in the title. The answer, or no, not break the spell, but the answer is to wake up, essentially.
Yes.
And it does become, especially if you're trying to kind of live the bodhisattva life and be in the world but not of the world, you feel the density, and you feel this like materialism and lack of soul, spirit, even heart, just so normalized in our culture. And so if you adapt to that world, and you start waking up and you start kind of trying to keep your old relationships, like you kind of get dragged back down by that density of the world, so it's not easy. There's a reason why people go off to the Himalayas and go meditate in caves to wake up, because it's easier when you don't have to deal with the world. That's the whole point. Exactly.
Very true. And that's kind of like the old spirituality, the old religions, which also was aware of this, Maya, the distortion of the matrix and all of that, but then turned it into that the salvation is out there, it's in heaven, somewhere being raptured in the Christian tradition or the Eastern tradition, just to become an aesthetic and reject the physical world completely, deny it. Right?
Yes, but the reason being is because they saw the evils of the world and they felt that the solution was to completely remove themselves from the world. So it's kind of like this beginner stage, and then there's the whole idea based in Mahayana Buddhism, the bodhisattva is like you go back with all of that knowledge that you gain, and you go back into the world to be of service to others. And the thing I find, I mentioned this on one of our calls the other day, but the whole thing of a bodhisattva is not just all love and light. It's actually really heartbreaking to enter in the world and to see the suffering that people are dealing with. Yeah. That was one of the first things actually the Buddha realized. He's like, he woke up to the suffering of the world. And so, that's something that I think is really essential to face. I remember actually whenever I would go back from doing medicine ceremonies in Peru, when I went for a few months and I was doing a bunch of ceremonies, and then I went back to the regular world. And for people who are listening, who I'm sure many of you've done psychedelics, you kind of anchor this state of consciousness, which is way different from your baseline, right? But then you kind of get to stay in that higher state of consciousness for a little bit after. Anyway, I went back into the world, into the downtown Vancouver area, and I just saw all of these false personalities just pretending no souls were really there in the bodies. Everyone was really armored up. The guys were just, when they get really muscular to the point where they can't even really move properly, and the women were just completely just kind of over sexualizing themselves. And that's what I saw, is just, I realized like, wow, the state of the world is extremely pathological. And it was so different from the high experiences of love I just experienced. And that was like a big kind of wake up call to me when I went and that would happen to me repeatedly as well, because I was living in the forest. I was doing a lot of meditation, and I would have to go back into the city. And every time I went back in a city, the first thing that I was confronted with was the depths of that people were just checked out, suffering. They didn't even know they were suffering. And it really hit me really deeply to just really in a sober state, actually experience the world in that way. And that's something I actually haven't been able to wipe off my vision.
Yeah. And the tricky part, so to speak, with this mass formation psychosis nowadays, and again, we go beyond, we are referencing Dr. Robert Malone, talked to mass formation psychosis around COVID, and everybody's just, exaggerating and just getting this fear frenzy and just madness out there, and completely not even scientific anymore, based on illusion, based on fear, based on conditioning, brainwashing, based on literally just a trauma response, anxiety, and all of that, right?
Yeah.
But what I want to also mention, really, the mass formation psychosis we are referencing, as you just talked about, is very tricky because most people are not aware of it, because we live in an age or in a time where pathologies have become normalized, right?
Yeah.
And again, I have to mention Krishnamurti's quote, which I've mentioned many times before over the years: "It is no measure of wealth to be healthy adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And that's what's happening. We see it all across the board, right? We see that in medicine, right? Like this, or extreme materialism. We see this nowadays. We have talked about this intensive rise of cosmetic surgeries in women and all of that, right? Where they're just trying to, like, this obsession with the physical youth and body, which also ties into the dawn of transhumanism, AI, man of merging with machine, and really like the materialistic, global, psychopathic elite being in charge, playing God, even with the whole materialistic view of medicine and all of that, which we also want to get into as well a bit.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And, the vaccine issue is just one battle on a 3D level, like we're in a war right now. So in a war, usually we have several battles going on. And really, if at its truest kind of spiritual essence, it's a battle for the human soul. So that's what it comes down to, is like, so that's why even like some of my poetry lately, I'm like, try to stay human and divine, And what I mean by staying human is that a lot of people, even the quest for eternal youth is a way of trying to avoid your humanity, of trying to avoid getting old, essentially, which I think actually has a sense of beauty in it if we really understand the cycles of nature. They want to remove us from natural law. That's the whole point. Exactly. They want to remove us from nature. So staying human is a huge piece of it. And I even say, like, just being able to be with what it feels like in this time in history, however it's showing up in your human life, and to be able to be with how that feels for you as in a human experience. And that's the gateway. Like, that's the gateway to your divine self, actually.
Yeah.
So as long as we're shut off from our hearts, we're shut off from our souls, we're shut off from our humanity. And that's what I actually see, is like, that's the heartbreaking thing, is I see a lot of people, including myself in certain circumstances, when I go out in like certain especially during these times with all the polarization, is like there's a certain level of like almost armoring up that I do to like kind of contain the pain that it is to witness this. And this was happening, as I said, way before even all this craziness happened. It's just become more exaggerated now. And that's the challenge. So it's easier said than done to stay human when your family and friends and like people you have to lose your job, but that's to me like the gold of the human experience.
Yeah, that put into question, what is it? What does it mean to be human? That's a whole can of worms in itself. Because if you talk to an atheist, materialist is different to somebody who's more spiritualized. And that ties into, again, we've mentioned this before, but it's really key to understand the different levels of being within humanity. Not everybody is the same. We all one, but at different levels. We've talked about it in light of evolutionary astrology, the dimly evolved state, the consensus state, which most people are in 75%, the individuated state, I believe, around 25% or something. 20%. And then the true spiritualized state, only 2% of humanity. And again, what we are experiencing right now, and we mentioned it before, a lot of people are now called to get out of the consensus state into the individuated state. And that's a huge process in itself.
Can I just redefine as well consensus state? These are paraphrased by the words of Jeffrey Wolf Green, who's the founder of evolutionary astrology. And he basically defines them as people whose identities are an extension of the societal norms, belief, and customs of their time. They completely identify with the beliefs and ideals and customs of their time. They're the mainstream of society. They don't think for themselves. They don't question what society tells them. And if they do ask questions, they will let them be answered by whatever the consensus of society says. So if the consensus of society says, basically the mainstream of society says vaccines are good, they're like, oh, vaccines are good. And then if they say they're bad later, unlikely to happen, but who knows, let's pray, then they think it's bad. So they just like, okay, what do I believe about this? And they go to society for answers, essentially. And they basically don't think for themselves at all. And then the people who reach the top of the consensus often become leaders of it. So this is like mainstream successful people, politicians, celebrities.
Give us some, let's tie this into this conversation here. Let's give some examples for that. Because on the top of the consensus
every politician,
they're already pushing it. Not necessarily all politicians, some of them, I don't know. But I would, in this instance, for example, call to Joe Rogan.
He's consensus,
Jordan Peterson. Weinstein, what they call the dark web, all of these people, even Dr. Robert Malone and these doctors speaking out, right? Because that's really what I would dive into in light of the mass psychosis. There are different levels. We need to look at it.
Well, so can I finish? Because
go ahead.
That actually, I personally think that Robert Malone and even Joe Rogan, for example, so that he also subdivided these states, and obviously, up for debate. I'm just putting out this theory. But basically, once you get to the third subdivision of consensus, you start to become in a position of power in your community, society, country in some way. They're on top of society. So these are actually, the people who hold important positions. I would actually put Robert Malone and Joe Rogan in this third state consensus, which means that they are maybe even, and I think what they're doing is they're reaching into the individuated state. And the individuated state is people who begin to ask questions about the beliefs, customs, and norms of the status quo. So, they basically want to act upon their own inner guidance to formulate their own beliefs and knowledge. So I can see, even in Robert Malone's own way, Joe Rogan's own way, they're edging into this individuated state because what they're saying is going against what the consensus is saying right now, essentially. Yes. So that's what makes them, starting to become individuated. So essentially, we want to get into this individuated state to kind of liberate ourselves from the conditioning of society. We move up the levels of the individuated state, and eventually we become into a spiritualized state, And for an example, in the beginning stages of the individuated state, the soul actually tries to appear normal still. They try to have a normal life, normal job, and they're also still attached to consensus as well. And this creates a real friction where they start to feel like they're living a lie, essentially. So they start to seek out alternative information. And, so a lot of people that are like even listening to the podcast, or maybe, have been for a while, are entering this individuated state. And then basically at the second subdivision, they start to rebel, and the rebellion can become so extreme that they're basically like, F all of society. I went through that phase.
Yeah.
And then they become third subdivision, individuated state, where they basically begin to manifest a role in society as a truly unique and gifted individual. So this is like Carl Jung, like the great thinkers who really moved society forward in some way, are this third subdivision of individuated state.
Yeah. I want to also add to this, so that's great summary to look at that from, but also really keep in mind that these different states, which by the way is also mirrored in other esoteric traditions. Again, Bernhard talks about the same, that before you can truly become spiritualized, you need to extract yourself from the herd, from the consensus, as he says in his own words, and become a true individual. But it's not, it could give the impression with the examples, this is just about all the knowledge you have, intellectual, what you see. But as you mentioned, it's actually a process of soul evolution.
Yeah.
So it's an internal process. It's it's kind of reflected in the knowledge and the way you see world from an intellectual level, but it's also your emotional embodiment, your spiritual embodiment, your psychological, all of that together, right?
Yeah,
it's like about soul evolution. That's what it comes down to. It's not just about intellectual knowledge.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the first subdivision of the spiritualized state. Is the point is that there's this natural humbling effect where the shift of gravity goes from ego to soul. Basically,
okay,
so
exactly.
That's when it's like, okay, like something, and then you kind of open up to greater kind of awareness of universal consciousness. Basically,
you finally transcend the ego.
Yeah, because if you look at a lot of people, they live in this extremely limited reality. Actually, like it's almost like there's all these blinkers on. They only see kind of what is kind of in front of them. They're run by habitual patterns. They're not living their life in any sort of conscious, aware, and even soul-based way, and I think even artists and writers, or people who work in some sort of creative field, they actually start to contact that soul a little bit in little moments.
Yeah, the reason we want to bring this up, really understand these different levels of consciousness in light of soul growth, the different stages, even here by Jeffrey Wolf Green, and again, it's mirrored in many other traditions. Because we always assume that everybody's the same and like kind of in light of soul evolution. And we want to look at these stages, obviously without judgment. The ego can easily hijack this, I'm individuated and you're just consensized or whatever. That already shows that you're probably not that if you have this thought.
Yes.
This judgment. But, what we see right now, there's so much craziness happening, obviously, with the whole so-called pandemic, the virus, the vaccines. A lot of more research is coming out, right, that about the variants, and then even questioning virology in itself, which I want to talk about more deeper as well, if there is even quote-unquote a virus, and questioning Western allopathic medicine in general. Rockefeller founded big pharma medicine, and that opens up a whole can of worms of what we truly believed over centuries, right, to question all of that.
Yeah.
But what I see now, there's two camps. Some camps, for example, Dr. Malone, he really was on Joe Rogan, and this other doctor, I forgot his name, Dr. McCullough, whatever his name was, on Joe Rogan, and to really they still quote unquote believe in the COVID and think it's dangerous and whatnot, but they're questioning the vaccine. So, and as you just mentioned, even the Joe Rogan podcast got censored. All the leftists, all the people from the consensus state are freaking out, attacking Dr. Malone and Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then within the so-called truth movement, right, some people say, yeah, it's amazing that it's coming out. And others, myself included, sometimes hold on, there's more to it, right? And then people jump, especially nowadays, they throw around words and expressions like controlled opposition, COINTELPRO, counterintelligence, gatekeeper around like candy nowadays, And by the way, I'm not taking myself out of the equation. I do this sometimes.
You don't really say that anymore.
Not anymore. I used to in the past, but also I've done all my research. There's definitely such thing as controlled opposition, counterintelligence, right?
Sure, yeah.
Absolutely. There's paid agents and distractions and all of that. We know that psyops. But nowadays, these expressions, as more and more people, quote unquote, have been red-pilled, are being thrown around we have been called controlled opposition, by the way.
Yeah,
what does it even mean?
As
if you're paid by the CIA or anything. I'm not getting any paychecks.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really important to understand this in light of the evolution of consciousness, because the way I see it, you could easily see that Joe Rogan with a $60 million Spotify deal is not, it's just going to say certain things and maybe, not have Dr. Andy Kaufman or Dr. Cohen out there who really present research that really question virology to begin with, which this whole pandemic is based on, this assumption that the virus actually exists, right? That needs to be questioned. Right. So a lot of people who get into that question virology find it good, as myself. Then a lot of people jump out and say, oh, Joe Rogan is just a gatekeeper. Dr. Maloney's controlled opposition and this and that. You know what I mean? We've been distracted. And that can open up, like a can of worms. You go down the rabbit hole into paranoia. And I've seen this happening over and over again with so many people when the trap of this conspiracy rabbit hole is like there are traps everywhere, right? There's no way out. Everything's controlled up, Hegelian dialect. And again, it's not to mean to dismiss these concepts, but we need to be very careful, because the way I see it right now, what Dr. Malone has done on Joe Rogan and at least questioning vaccines, right?
Yeah.
Plays its part to reach a certain part of the consensus.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed.
You cannot go right away to like, hold on, the world is controlled by hyperdimensional occult force that feed off of our soul essence, and virology is a fraud. There's no, you know what I mean? Like, even if there's truth to it, you cannot reach people like that. No. Right?
And so, can I just give an example? Is because the main thing that what happens is when you're individuating is you get the backlash from the consensus. You get the backlash from Saturn because remember, the individuated state is actually ruled by Uranus, which is kind of the lightning bolt of like change and illumination, right? And Saturn likes things to stay the same. So the fact that they're getting so much backlash from the consensus from Saturn, to me, is the proof that they're actually individuating. Because if you were just playing the line, and if even Joe Rogan, you see in some areas he does toe the line a little bit, right? But when he goes into his individuated state and we start saying things that are outside the realm of the consensus, the backlash from Saturn from the consensus happens.
He has been pushing it a bit, definitely more than I thought he would, But I see too many people, they're so externally focused on the matrix and this information controlled up this. They don't see it in light of the bigger picture of the evolution of consciousness, because everybody has their quote soul lessons, including Joe Rogan, Dr. Malone. He also talks out of his own conditioned medical, programming, so to speak, right? And it's not necessarily until, here's the thing, I have a great quote by, I'm going to talk about this more in the second hour, by Dr. Tom Cowan, who also wrote an amazing book called Breaking the Spell, the Scientific Evidence for Ending the COVID Delusion, which we'll talk about later.
Do you want me to read it? Or read it?
But I want to get into it when we talk more about virology.
Okay.
A bit later,
Sounds good.
But just to summarize, he made a good point, because he's been asked if these people are just controlled up. He says, I don't know, what do I know? Until you have true evidence that there's somebody is controlled up, and not make assumptions, because based on all kinds of guilt of associations and whatnot, what does it even mean? We all can be, quote unquote, sometimes spread disinformation, because nobody knows the whole truth, and it's a learning process. Even this whole virology was a big process for me over the past year to come a deeper understanding and question that aspect of Western medicine. But what we're getting at, and I think what we're also seeing, is like this infighting in the quote unquote truth community. What that means anyway. I'm not part of any truth community. But just for lack of better words, I want to really breaking this out, because what really is happening is we're in an informational warfare, psychological warfare. And what's happened in the truther community, for people that only focus on information and have no self-awareness, no emotional intelligence, are not engaged in any deeper psychological work or spiritual work.
They have very shallow.
Or where shallow, like pop psychology, pop spirituality, just repeating memes and quotes, right? But not engaged in the work. Then they can also become part of the spell of mass formation psychosis, in the context of which we just described that, meaning where Tico takes over and infiltrates these movements and communities.
Exactly.
Right? And then they fight each other because of they shadow project on each other, the ego gets triggered, then, all kind of temptations, fame, money, and all this comes into it, popularity. And that's how they destroy themselves. And, I always appreciate David Whitehead's view. I had him on a few times, and he said, we need to unite the clans. We need to fight together the bigger fight. And, in certain battles we lose here and there, but like you mentioned, for example, the whole vaccine and COVID is just one small part. There's this whole other thing in the living room with cultural Marxism, communism taking over the world as well.
And never mind this materialistic culture that we live in that's totally removed from soul and spirit.
Exactly.
Like that's also the bigger one. And, and I heard this great term, I don't know who I heard it from, but this ideological purity, basically where you just like, and you see people where like, they expect, which is a very childish way of living, I think, expect that everyone has to agree with them on every single thing that they believe, and in order for them to support them. And it's like, it's just not realistic. Like you and I can't agree on anything, and we're like, in a deep relationship. So, we don't have to agree on every single thing to be on the same team right now. We're in, and that's what I tried to communicate that also recently in some in a tweet, like about how we will lose this war if we are divided within. Like imagine an army and there's like people who are just like hating on each other, wanting to take each other down within the same side of the army. Obviously I don't know much about the army, by the way, but you know what I mean? Like it would actually, you leave yourself vulnerable to the enemy when you do that.
Exactly.
And you're leaving. And I think we're going to actually see a bit more of this as well, because we have a lot of people speaking out. We have a lot of people speaking truth, but I'm actually watching a lot of major players in this psychologically disintegrate, and their own egos are getting involved. So like it's like, so, like as long as you have wounds from childhood where you weren't validated or mirrored in an essential way, or you just don't have good self-esteem, and that can also, by the way, represent itself by also very high narcissistic self-esteem, is you become actually vulnerable to like the matrix temptations, because the matrix will always try and tempt you on an ego level. It will always try and appeal to your ego. So as long as you're seeking money, power, fame, sex, you get off on all the people who are positively projecting on you, you become vulnerable to these forces. And that's why, like, it's like we sound like a broken record sometimes, the way the things we talk about, but it's true. It's like you can't be tempted by the dark forces if you're connected to soul and spirit, because that's what makes you truly sovereign, is because you don't actually give a F about what goes on.
Exactly. On that note, what people don't understand how the matrix forces really work is not, obviously sometimes they're very overt and obvious in your face and very pathological, and you see the evil right in your face. But most often the way it works and has worked for thousands of years is very subtle, as you said, via temptation.
Exactly.
And these forces, vertigo, understand the matrix is not really out there. It's a mind program. It's working through you, through us, right? We are transducers of higher energies. This whole idea that you're in control, the ego personality is in control, is the biggest illusion. It's another mass formation psychosis, by the way, right? This identification with the ego personality. But there are other forces, and they tag into our own weaknesses, blind spots, shadow aspects, traumas, wounds, and all of that, which they use against us.
Exactly.
And feed off in all kinds of temptations, inserting thoughts, desires, wants, and needs that are literally not our own, but we take for our own. And that's how the matrix has you in more subtle ways, right? Mm-hmm. But again, from the esoteric tradition, then if you understand this, are aware of it, engage in the great work, you can use these interferences or these forces as a teaching function to know where they tag into and exaggerate. But hence, so what is the way out again, out of this mass formation psychosis, is again to engage in what many people call the great work. It is the necessity to engage in the inner work on all levels, what we call the fourfold approach of holistic self-work, which we go deeper into our course as well, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And what we see again over and over again in the truth movement, even the health movement, so to speak, is the over focus just on physical health,
3D
the
stuff,
body, 3D stuff, and information. And even psychologically and spiritually, it's very much more like
pop psychology,
I would say.
Exactly. It's just feel good hits of information and not really engaging in that deeper kind of soul work, and I think that takes a certain orientation. And I actually think there's a point, I think the true meaning of the aesthetic and that kind of stage of evolution is like, you need to give up on the idea that the consensus world will make you happy, because it won't. And as long as you're seeking consensus kind of wins, whether it's like fame or money or attention or pop, whatever, even like starting these movements, like, you know what I mean? Like, there is a movement happening. I'm not denying it, but it's like it's a very consensus way of thinking. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so as long as you are kind of a slave to those desires, and you're attached to that world, the Matrix has a hook on you, you know?
That reminds me also, a lot of people got really excited when the famous tennis player Novak Djokovic, I think is you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Serbian player was supposed to play Australian Open and he's not vaccinated, doesn't want to get vaccinated.
He just got rejected from the country, by the way.
Yeah, and he just got sent home.
Yeah,
so that fell through, right? And people like, we stand with Novak and he's a hero. And I can understand it. I have compassion, empathy for that. Like people want that hero.
They
somebody
need a hero.
famous.
They actually need heroes right now.
They need a celebrity that stands up against it.
Yeah.
But also like, not to be a party pooper, but he has his own self-interest.
Positive projections, too.
Like he wants to play, the tournament. He's highly successful, driven by his own ambitions. If he would truly be anti-vax and really stand up for truth, he has made more than enough money to live off for generations. Just quit it all and really go and speak truth, right? But he's not going to do it, obviously, because again, he's part of the consensus state. This is not his role right now.
Yeah.
So we need to stop waiting. I see so many people, when is Joe Rogan speak more, Jordan Peterson, they already play their role where they're at, right? And what do we know about their deeper soul, purpose, and lessons and all of that?
Yeah.
And we can always say like they should do this and maybe they're selfish, but we need to focus, look at yourself, what you do, what you contribute to the world, creatively, solution-oriented, and not just information-wise. How much do you really work on yourself to, as cheesy and cliche it sounds, but truly be the change?
Yes.
Because this time of transition is not going to be won, this war, by just information alone, right?
And then
because most people are simply not receptive for that.
No. And it is hard, like there's a reason why you and I are so introverted for the most part and just kind of do our work like, just kind of chop wood, carry water, guiding people through the group program is because, we have a lot of work on our table and not just physical work, which we have a lot of too, but just inner work. We study, we learn, we apply, we contemplate. Like, this is really like we have found a key to true fulfillment essentially, and it's in the divine, and it's through clearing out all of the kind of complexes and issues that we have in the way of that. So, it is something that it's a deep process, and it's not for everyone. But I think the thing we're trying to say is that, there has to be an awareness of of the hooks that evil can have within you. And I see this it's also part of this whole kind of, maybe that's the concept of sin. I don't really know Christianity that well, but like, we have evil, which works through us, which works through our shadow, which works through our blind spots. And it's like, that's what we have to conquer, And as long as you are overly identified with your ego personality, which a lot of people might say, oh, I'm not, but even the voice that I'm speaking to is actually my conditioned ego's personality with my soul trying to communicate through it. So we all have this kind of interface that we interface with the world with, which is not actually our true essence, Yeah. And the point is we want to shift ultimately, and I may be skipping stages here, but shift that center of gravity to the soul essentially. And that's like an ongoing process. And it's like you chip and chip and chip, and then eventually you have this opening, So how do you break the spell? I'm going to give some exact kind of prompts. So by deconditioning, you break the spell by deconditioning yourself of consensus beliefs. So a reflection question is like, what do I believe? Why do I believe that? And where did I get that belief from? Those are just the questions to constantly ask yourself. And some people may have already done that, who are listening to this podcast. So that's the first phase.
On that note, like also check your assumptions. I can see myself. That's also where basic critical thinking comes in. We mostly base our worldview and actions on assumptions, right? For example, we assume that there is a pandemic and virus, and we just take for granted that whatever the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, the government, and CDC tells us, oh, there's a virus in this pandemic and there's this, but have you really questioned that?
And then,
right?
and then we'll go deeper in the
second. How do we know that?
Yeah, we'll go deeper in the second hour is we assume that the allopathic medical system, which is basically the treatment of disease through drugs in its essence, that's the system, that this is a good system and we should keep going with this, And even when people were sharing like the Supreme Court thing happened, they're like, oh, what about the nurses, and that, it's like, for me, I've lost faith in that mainstream medical system for a while. I think that needs to change and go. Maybe it just needs to completely be be let go of and we move on to a different alternative system? I don't know, but I just know that system is actually removed from soul and spirit because it's materialistic. So
exactly.
Anyway, let's go back to the points, if that's okay with you. Okay, so you break the spell by learning how to think for yourself. And that takes some, like, you got to get the cogs in your head going, you know? So rather than just looking to other people on what to think or what believe, it's like, but what do I, connected with my soul, which is connected to a higher spirit, actually believe here? You know, and I'm not talking about subjective truth. I'm just, you know, learning how to use different muscles than we're used to, I think.
Yeah. Which, by the way, on that note, you know, we are also being dumbed down. The attention span is lower than ever before because we're bombarded with information, social media. Everybody has ADD. Nobody can read a book. People read 2 paragraphs I post and they think, oh my God, this is too long to to read. You know, so that's also how the Matrix has you. Your attention span, your focus.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. I'm not taking myself out of that equation either. So not only do you want to also do inner work so you can connect to your soul, your heart, your true essence, you also, I think, you know, it is about eventually activating the higher mind, you know? So I'm talking about, as Rudolf Steiner would say, the intuitive, inspirational, imaginative realms, essentially, which we have a whole thing out in our course. And I think that is not something that really turns on until you develop the sensitivity. A lot of people say, just trust your intuition. And I think, exactly. And it's like, well, what is your intuition? And how do you know that's your intuition? And how do you know that's not a thought form or conditioned belief, you know? Because conditioned beliefs and the neural pathways that are really worn down, that they kind of go down, you know, these can feel very intuitive because you can feel very fixed in them and be like, oh, I'm so sure this is real, but that's not intuition, you know? So which beliefs are also a reflection of this higher realm and which were programmed into you by family, fears, culture. So this is like an ongoing process. And by the way, I personally think that it's just not like a one and done thing. It's like layers. Like I had no idea how much of what I believed was actually programmed into me via cultural Marxism, essentially, because that was my whole kind of upbringing. You know, I was raised by like hippies who were like really from the back in the 70s. You know, I wasn't born in the 70s, but they were kind of part of that whole hippie movement, you know, and a lot of my beliefs were handed to me by my parents. And it doesn't mean that all of those beliefs were not of use to me. I actually even was told as a child that the world is a mirror of you. So that's a good belief, right? That's a good way of experiencing reality. But a lot of those had to go through this deconditioning process. And you also break the spell by learning how to live as your true nature. So when you're an authentic, ground, whole, loving human being, which is like very rare in the world today as well.
Yeah, but on that note, also like if authenticity can also be, people mistake this justifying their own neuroses, pathologies and projections and all of that.
Yeah.
Authenticity in this context is connecting to your true essence. It's again, not your ego personality.
Exactly. Like, you know, I can just tell someone's being just very fake, and it's like the fakeness is actually they're just running programs that were given to them by culture, essentially. So essentially, you know, we said this so many times in our podcast, we need to be more concerned about observing ourselves and remembering our true nature than being frustrated at the sleepers. Because why, you know, like, you know, it is really being the change you want to see in the world. You know, the sleepers really wake up when their soul is ready. That's what it comes down to. And you do inspire people more by just being what is something that's attractive to them. Because soul qualities, you know, are attractive to people they're attractive to their soul, essentially. Their ego may struggle with it, but, you know, we radiate outwards towards others, and people are just like, wow, what's that person doing? I'm curious about that person, you know, rather than just trying to reach them on the mental realm alone. We actually have to reach them through the heart, essentially. Yeah.
Well said. So that's some good pointers to really understand the mass formation psychosis goes way beyond what's happening with this whole pandemic, COVID and so-called virus and whatnot. But the whole setup, we are living in the dark ages. Some say the Kali Yuga, the furthest removed from the divine, from our true essence, where pathologies have become normalized. And in our, you know, being very honest with yourselves, right, as well, the humility to admit this also, how we, you know, not only may believe in lies, but lie to ourselves, you know, to not lose our attachments, our relationships, our identifications, our desires, what we think we want, and all of that. Because again, As Adyashanti said, enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to become with more happier and all these conditional things. The ego personality needs something external to feel a certain way. It's very dependent.
Yeah. He has another great quote I read recently. I reposted it about like, when you become enlightened, there's no one to become enlightened. Like, that's the whole point of enlightenment.
Exactly. Then there's a whole paradox right there.
So in the next hour, we're definitely going to talk more about, Dr. Tom Cowan's work, the allopathic medical system.
Questioning virology. I want to dive deeper into that. I also want to talk about something like I want to dive more esoteric, which ties into what I just mentioned as well, that everybody also is an expression of the divine in their own way, no matter the distortion and ignorance. And there's a beautiful passage from Sri Aurobindo's book, The Life Divine, where he talks about the divine always uses anything and anyone to do, God's work to do the best ability relative to the ignorance, deficiencies, and soul lessons. And that's a key point to understand without falling this black and white, or you're controlled up, you're good, you're bad, and all of that, right? So it's really like having this more nuanced view of reality, right?
Yes.
And not this very extreme, crude black and white view, which is mostly our own projections, right?
Yes, it's the projections from the ego, because if you see the world through the eyes of the divine, which I think is another one of his quotes.
Exactly, and also on admitting, like even ourselves, you and I included, the whole point of evolution of consciousness. And I've talked this in depth in my articles, and we go this in deep in our course as well, is to become more and more objective, to see the world as it is, to see it with the eyes of the divine. But none of us are able to see with the eyes of the divine. None of us are truly awake in that true meaning of the word. So we still have our subjective blind spots, our unconscious bias, and all of that. So we need to be able to admit this within ourselves, because seeking truth within and without is a process, continuing process.
Okay, so to close it off, I'm just going to end with a little bit of a quote from Muji, who, yes, I'm aware has been canceled, by the way, before we get that comment. But it's a really beautiful quote, kind of summarizes what we're pointing at. So, and he says, if you make human company too important, you will not discover your true self. Relationships not based in truth are never entirely reliable and are rarely enduring. Taking time to discover yourself is the best use of time. Prioritize this. One should not excessively seek partners or friends. One should seek to know and be oneself. As you begin to awaken to the truth, you'll start noticing how well life flows by itself and how well you are cared for. Life supports the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual needs of the one who is open to self-discovery. Trust opens your eyes to the recognition of this. Surrender allows you to merge in your own eternal being.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, just to close off, we are doing our 12-week Embodied Soul Awakening private online group coaching program, which is a coaching program in psychological and spiritual self-work. It's going to begin on April 11th, but the applications are opening now. Don't wait on it, because literally the last program was so full, we had to run another one at the same time because the demand was so high and we felt to rise to the occasion. So if you want more info, again, you can go to Bernhard's Veil of Reality site and you'll see it under courses, or you can just go directly to the application and tell us about yourself at www.awakenapply.com. So with that being said, much love to you guys, and see you on the second hour.
Yeah, and for anybody who's new to the podcast and want to have access to the second hour, you can become a member at my website as well, veilofreality.com, which will give you access to all the second hour of all podcasts, past podcasts, and also access to the membership forum. All right, see you all in the second hour.